Hello there, IELTS students. Welcome to IELTS Podcast. You no longer have to worry, fret, or panic about IELTS because we are here to guide you through this test jungle. Enjoy these IELTS tutorials, and if you need more help or want to access the famous online course, you can visit us at IELTSPodcast.com.
Today's tutorial is going to focus on Task 1, and specifically, it's going to focus on my least favorite Task 1. As you probably know by now, in academic IELTS, there are several different types of Task 1 that you could encounter, and everyone seems to have a different least favorite. I know that most of my students really dislike process diagrams, and some of them dislike maps. But to be honest, the one that I find the most challenging for me personally is the table. Now, I know that might seem a little surprising, but it actually isn't if you really think about it. Because what happens is you get this table, and all of a sudden you're just looking at these numbers kind of randomly assembled on the page, and you have to make sense of all of them. You have to make sense of their relationship to each other, which is the highest, which is the lowest. So it's not like a line graph or like a bar chart where instantly you know which the highest figure is, you know what's the lowest, and you can pretty much tell, oh, okay, this is double this is 1/3 of this, and so forth. So those, they're really kind of easy to distinguish the biggest trends or the biggest differences, the biggest increases. So when you're looking at a table, you actually have to do a little math, don't you? I mean, you're looking at all these numbers, and most of the time the numbers are kind of scrambled together, so you're not really sure where to start. And so one of the things that I find myself doing when I see a table is I actually do a little math. And this takes obviously a little bit of time. It's worth it, of course, to understand these relationships between the numbers or among the numbers. But like I said, it's one of the reasons why I find tables the most challenging. So in order to have an example for you for this tutorial today, I am referring to a table that comes from the Cambridge IELTS book number 7. If you don't have Cambridge 7, I know that there are images of this particular table all throughout the internet. If you look on your search engine and just type in Cambridge IELTS 7 table, you should be able to find it pretty readily throughout the web. It is a table regarding the expenditures of 5 different countries in 3 different consumer areas. So try to have this open so you can refer to it while I'm giving this tutorial. I think it will help if you have the image in front of you. So what do we do with a table like this? Well, let's take a look at it. Basically, you have 15 pieces of information. Now, it probably goes without saying that you're not going to write a Task 1 answer that is 15 sentences, 1 sentence for each piece of data, which means that you have to do something a little more advanced, and you essentially have to appropriately categorize, you have to group information, and you have to edit information. Because the last thing you want is for 15 separate sentences for each of these figures here. So like I said, we're going to have to do something a little different. Keeping in mind, of course, our word count, which is a minimum of 150 words. So we know that we have 15 pieces of data. We can see here that we have 3 categories and 5 countries. So what's the first thing I do? Well, I read the task. And here it appears that, like I said, it is 3 types of consumer spending from 5 different countries in the year 2002. And this is extremely, extremely important information for a couple of reasons. The first reason why is because I can see that it's taking place in the past. It's taking place in 2002, which means I'm only going to be using past tenses, okay, and not really a bunch of past tenses. I won't need to be using past perfect or anything, but I can pretty much use past simple almost exclusively. I know that some people like to use the present tense, so they say things like, in the graph we can see, etc., etc. And that's okay, but when you're referring to the actual figures and you're referring to the data in the table, you're going to need to use the past simple here. So that's the first thing that we need to realize, what kind of tenses we're going to use. The other thing, though, that this information tells us, which is extremely, extremely important, is that it's just one period of time. So the only time that we're concerned with is 2002. Why is that important? Because it really changes how we're going to approach this table. Essentially, there are two different types of charts, of graphs in IELTS. And we typically call them static or dynamic. So the static ones are the ones like this one today, which takes place just in one particular point in time, in 2002. And then the other type we call dynamic. And those are ones that show a change over time. So you might have 2 different years or 3 different years. So you might have 2002 and then 2004 and then 2006. So why is this important information? Because like I said, the vocabulary you're going to use and the way you approach this task is going to change based on what kind it is. Because if it is dynamic, then you're going to have to talk about changes over time. You're going to have to refer to increases, decreases, fluctuations, things doubling, things tripling. But if it's a static diagram, like what we have here, then you're really just going to be comparing the information, talking about what's higher than something else, what's lower. So you treat the data differently. Okay, so this is why reading the information in the task is really important. Once you've done that and you know both what tenses you're going to look at and what kind of information you have, if it's static or dynamic, the next thing you need to do, since we're looking at a table, is figure out what the key information is. Key information is really important. It's the information that you really, really should not be missing in your answer. And in fact, if you look at the public band descriptors for task achievement in Task 1, they refer to these key features in bands 4, 5, and 6. So how much you cover them will really determine whether you get a 4, a 5, or a 6 in task achievement. So if you don't mention the key features, you're looking at a 4. If you kind of mention some of them or not maybe enough, band 5, and then of course band 6 is assumes that you've mentioned all the key features. So looking at this table, what are those key features? In the table, I believe that the key features are essentially all of those descriptors on the outside. So you've got the 3 columns here. Food, drinks, tobacco is 1. Clothing, footwear is the 2nd. And leisure and education is the 3rd. So you absolutely need to refer to those 3 categories. If you miss one of them, that's a problem. That's key information. And then, of course, the 5 countries should also be mentioned, at least by name. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go into this major description of the 3 different categories for each country. Like I said, that would be really kind of repetitive and not categorizing appropriately. But you need to at least mention that the table you're looking at has these 5 countries. Another thing that's really important is I don't know if it's necessarily key information, but another thing that's really important is looking along the side, and not just for tables, of course, but for all task ones. There's usually some sort of a key which tells you if the figures you're looking at are percentages, if they're numbers, if they're in the thousands, in the hundreds, in the millions, in tons, or so forth. This is really important because it then affects how accurate your data is. Because obviously you paint a completely different picture of the data. If you say, 300, 400, and 500, when you're really supposed to be saying 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, you completely change the image of the chart, of the diagram. Another thing that is extremely, extremely important is to see if they're referring to percentages or numbers. Also really important, because the last thing you want to do is refer to percentages as numbers. You don't want to say, for example, that Ireland spent almost 29 on food, drinks, and tobacco. 29 what? So it's really important to make sure that you're talking about percentages here, if it's about percentages. Otherwise, you need to know what it is exactly, what sort of measurement you're talking about. Okay, so if we go straight into it then, there are a couple of other different choices you have to make before you start writing. How are you going to organize your answer? Are you going to organize it by talking about the columns? In other words, talking about food, drinks, and tobacco, clothing and footwear, leisure and education? Or are you going to do it country by country? It really depends, and there's not like a one-size-fits-all answer here. In this particular table, I would prefer to approach it by columns. You've got these 3 columns here of spending, so I think it makes for more logical organization if you group your answer like that. So when you start actually looking at the data within the table, it's probably a good idea to circle some of the most important ones. So going down that column for food, drinks, and tobacco, right away I see that the highest figure here is that of Turkey, 32%. I would circle that. What comes next is Ireland. Okay, so I would also circle that too. Another thing that I want to make a mental note of is that the lowest countries here are have half the percentage of Turkey. So if Turkey is 32%, the other two, Italy and Sweden, spend half of that. So that's something to keep in mind for later. Looking at clothing and footwear, I also see some interesting information here. Right away, I want to circle that 9% under Italy, because that's the highest within that column. And then if you look at the other 4 figures here, they're pretty similar to each other. So that's another kind of mental note I'm going to want to make. They all kind of range between 5.4 and 6.6. Then that last quarter category with the lowest figures, you've got a little variety here. Turkey again has the highest figure in this column at 4.35, so I would circle that. But I also think it's worth noting that the rest of them are considerably lower, with Spain having the lowest figure. So I might want to circle that number as well. Why do we do these? Why do we do this? Because these are probably the elements that we're going to want to refer to specifically. And a lot of those like middle numbers that aren't so interesting or that don't really provide us kind of key data, we may want to kind of wash over them with not so much detail. Okay, so if we've done all of this kind of preparation work, then we need to start off with our introduction. An introduction for a table like this doesn't have to be anything kind of earth-shattering. A simple kind of typical introduction would be something like, the table provides information regarding spending in 3 different categories in Ireland, Italy, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey in 2002. Now, I don't have a lot of countries here, and so I've decided to mention them in my introduction. You can do this. This way you make sure that you haven't left any country out. So if for some reason you don't mention it later on in your description, then at the very least you mentioned it by name in your introduction. And then after our introduction, different teachers recommend different things here. So I will certainly tell you what I recommend. Here is where you want to place your overview. Like I said, different teachers also refer to this differently. Some teachers call it an overview, others call it a summary. However you choose to call it, it is basically the sentence or two sentences that show the biggest trend, the most obvious feature, the thing that really stands out here. So for me, having circled some of the data in this table, it's obviously that figure for food, drinks, and tobacco, with Turkey having that highest number. So my overview would be something like this. Food, drink, and tobacco accounted for the highest percentage of spending in all countries, with Turkey spending the highest proportion of the 5 countries. Because what we focus on really is that highest figure, that most salient figure. And what I've done here is I've actually kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone, because I told you which column had the highest percentage of spending. And I also told you among that information which country was the highest. What you don't want to do here is include specific data. It's just your overview. You want the reader, the examiner, to get a general idea of what you're looking at. That's the most important thing. You're going to go into detail later. In fact, I should mention this now. One of the things that I find some of my students do when they first begin writing Task 1 is they think, oh, well, I've mentioned Turkey in my overview, so I don't need to mention it again. No, absolutely wrong. All you did is really just give me kind of like a trailer, kind of like a commercial for what's going to follow. I don't know anything about Turkey's numbers. I don't know anything about its figures, its percentages. So you've given me essentially some key information, but I don't know anything specific. So you're absolutely going to want to mention Turkey with specific figures later on in your description. Okay, so after you've written your introduction and your overview, you'll want to go into the details. And this is where you're going to want to mention, again, food, drinks, and tobacco, and Turkey, of course, but this time with that specific data we mentioned. So you would start off your paragraph with something like this. The greatest proportion of spending was in food, drinks, and tobaccos, with Turkey having the highest figure at 32.14%. This was followed closely by Ireland at almost 29%. You can see that I've rounded the figure here. It was 28.9, so I rounded it up to 29. Absolutely appropriate, it's okay. The remaining countries were between 15 and 19%. Now, they were all fairly similar, so what I decided to do is I decided to group them together. And there are 2 ways you can group information like this together. You can group them together in a range, like I just did. I said that they were between 15 and 19%. Or you could use something that I call a ceiling. A ceiling is basically a top number, and then you just assume that everything falls underneath that. So you could have said that the remaining countries were under 19%. So you have those 2 options. So you don't have to necessarily mention the 3 other countries that they were 15.7% and 16.36% and 18. So it's not really important. You may want to do that at one point for one of the categories, but especially in something like this where the figures were similar, I grouped them together in a range, and I get out of there and I go to my next column. Remember, I mean, it's a task that you have 20 minutes for. You have to show all the key features, the key trends here. So you don't want to go into too much minutia here. So then I go into my second category. And I would start my sentence something like, the second highest percentage of spending was found in food and footwear. Here, Italy had the greatest proportion at 9%. The remaining countries all spent approximately 6%. So here I took the other 4 countries and I just grouped them together around an average, because the lowest figure here is 5.4, the highest is 6.6. So I can safely say with a qualifier like around that they're all approximately in that range, in that kind of 6% area. And again, I'm out of there. I don't have to go into tons and tons of detail. And then my next paragraph or my next column would be something like, the lowest category of spending was found in leisure and education. Turkey again accounted for the greatest percentage at 4.35. Spain had the lowest at almost 2%. You can see again I've rounded up here. Italy and Sweden spent an identical portion at approximately 3.2%. So here I decided to give a little more information just to make sure that I have met my word limit, my word minimum. Okay. I could possibly even mention the one country that I didn't. But again, because I included all 5 countries in my introduction, I don't need to make sure, like, especially in the kind of panic, like, oh no, did I mention Italy? Did I mention Spain? Did I mention Sweden? In fact, I don't think I mentioned, I did mention Sweden at the end. Okay. But if there was some country that I hadn't mentioned, because I mentioned them in the introduction, I'm safe. I haven't left out any of those key features here, which we said were the countries. And that's pretty much how I would approach a table like this. There is, of course, the issue of my coherence and cohesion. As you know, a previous podcast I did focused on coherence and cohesion. You may have noticed I didn't really use a lot of linking devices. I didn't need to. I did use things like here. I also used this, which were cohesive devices. And as far as paragraphing, the band descriptors don't really say much. They don't focus a whole lot on paragraphing for task 1. There are a couple of different ways you could divide your paragraphs for something like this and still be fine. I would probably want to keep my introduction and overview together in one paragraph. And then you can make a choice here. You can have one paragraph for each of the 3 categories. You can separate them like that. Or you could have one paragraph just for food, drink, and tobacco, since you're going to go into some detail about it. And then you could put the other 2 categories together in their own paragraph. That's an appropriate way. But I would really hesitate to say that there is absolutely one correct way. It really depends. It really depends on how you want to look at it. And I know that some people would even recommend one paragraph just for their introduction and overview, and then lump all the details together. I would really hesitate to say this is the right way, and there is no other right way. As far as my lexical resource is concerned, you probably noticed that I used words like proportion and percentage and specific percents, and then words like figure. Figure is a word I love because you can use it instead of number, you can use it instead of percent, and it's really like a catch-all word, and this way you're not so repetitive. Other vocabulary that I think was useful here was accounted for, a proportion of spending, followed closely, identical proportion. And in terms of grammar, the task didn't really allow a lot of flexibility or a lot of range, but you may have noticed that I used a participle clause when I said, with Turkey having the highest percentage. You do want to be careful with your prepositions. I know I said some things like such and such country at 5%. So you do want to be careful because you want to make sure that the prepositions you use are correct. So that's how I approach a table. It's really a lot about grouping the information appropriately, focusing on the important information in each category, but the stuff that's maybe not so majorly important, you really kind of group together in an appropriate way. I hope you found this helpful. Definitely keep writing. There are lots of tables available all throughout the web. Also, in lots of different IELTS books, you'll find tables. Have your writing corrected through the correction service at IELTSPodcast.com. Here, the feedback you'll get is absolutely priceless. You really, it's the best way to progress in your preparation, to have somebody who is really experienced looking at your writing. And then, of course, there is the online course, which provides tons and tons of information, not only on Task 1, but on Task 2, on speaking. So check them out. Sign up for updates from IELTSPodcast.com. And best of luck with your preparation.
Thanks for listening to IELTSPodcast.com.